This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with retired Marine Corps Major General Arnold Punaro, who serves as the chairman of the Secretary of Defense's Reserve Forces Policy Board. They discuss the breakdown of the military confirmation process in Congress and what to expect from future presidential administrations.
Major General Arnold Punaro, welcome to the show.
Well, Roger, it's such a privilege to be with you and your listeners.
Well, you have a storied career here in Washington, inside the Beltway. You are known widely. You, of course, are retired Major General in the U.S. Marine Corps. I spent more than 2 decades in the U.S. Senate, including staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee. But what we're going to talk about today is your latest book, your third prolific author over here. The book is called If Confirmed. Go on Amazon and purchase it. An insider's view of the national security confirmation process. And what's cool about this book is that someone might think that this is unique to inside the Beltway matters, something between the Pentagon and the White House. And it is. But it also tells us a lot about the country and what's at stake for the country through this constitutional process. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. Arnold, tell our viewers and listeners why you chose to write a book about the confirmation process.
Well, Roger, as you well know from your own personal service and expertise in government and sense, and the really truly legendary work in the national security area going on at the Reagan Institute, the world today is more dangerous, turbulent, and uncertain than the peak of the Cold War that we lived through, that your dad lived through, one of the key leaders in our government at that time. And we need the very best people to serve in government in these very, very challenging times. And the founding fathers set up the advice and consent role of the United States Senate under the Constitution. The president gets to nominate people for key leadership positions, including civilian control of the military and the senior warfighting commanders in our military. And we need the very best people now to serve in those positions. And frankly, from the many years decades I've been doing this, I've seen this confirmation process go from working well to badly bent, and now it's frankly totally broken. I wanted to write the book to basically encourage the very best people to be willing to consider serving in government, show them how they could be more successful in the confirmation process, and then make some serious recommendations for reforms that are needed so that basically we get the people we need into these key positions on a much more timely basis than we do today.
So I want to talk later on about these reforms, but I want to kind of build our way to it. I think getting the best people is intuitive. It's common sense. Well, if things are intuitive and common sense, it means it's probably not happening in Washington, D.C. these days. And you just characterize a confirmation process as broken. I want you to explain, as you do in your book, why it's broken. What are the metrics for demonstrating that it indeed is not working? And in particular, if you could lay out kind of the way in which a confirmation process is kind of critical, particularly in a unique way to the military, to the Department of Defense, because it's not only civilians we're talking about, Arnold, as you point out. These are thousands, tens of thousands of confirmations that involve the military too, the general and flag officers as well. So tell us how it's broken and how that extends on the civilian and military side.
So it's broken for a number of reasons. The first fundamental reason that it's broken is there's been an amazing proliferation and increase in the number of positions that are required to go through the Senate confirmation process. We've gone through a few hundred to over 1,200 now government-wide. In the Department of Defense, we've gone from having under 10 to now 65 civilians that require the Senate confirmation process, from the Secretary of Defense to the deputy to the military service secretaries, et cetera. And when it comes to the military, over 50,000 military nominations, all the field grade nominations, all the general and flag officer nominations have to go through the Senate confirmation process. And frankly, the Congress is not the Congress of many decades ago where they actually did a full work week. The Senate basically these days works from Tuesday afternoon to Thursday morning. And basically you don't get a lot of work done and they take a lot of recesses. So they just aren't they aren't in a position to process all these numbers. The second thing that's happened is federal judges that used to be bipartisan, nonpartisan, senators from their home state had a process for approving them. It didn't matter what administration was in power or who controlled the Senate. Now all federal judges have to go through a very laborious procedure called the cloture process, and that bogs the Senate down when it comes to considering other nominations, because that soaks up a tremendous amount of time in the Judiciary Committee on the floor. So basically, there are just way too many numbers of people that have to go through the confirmation process for them to be done in a timely fashion. In the Kennedy administration, all his senior people in all his cabinet departments were confirmed within 3 months. Today, in both Obama, Biden, and Trump, it's now over a year. Basically, you're lucky in the Department of Defense if we get the secretary and the deputy done in the early days of the administration in January. Then even the other level twos, which are the key civilian control positions, the service secretaries, you know, in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration, they were 5, 6 months, 8 months getting on the job.
We just have to just capture, you know, great job and a clear explanation in terms of how this is broken and the impact of it. You just think about what you just said. It takes a year for a president to get his personnel confirmed.
Correct.
And that's a quarter of their time in office.
That's right. I mean, it's in the average tenure of political appointee is usually 18 months. They come and go. So, I mean, it just doesn't work. And again, it's not just the time. The Senate Armed Services Committee, like the House Armed Services Committee, still operates in a very bipartisan fashion. And the leaders we have on those two, both Democrats and Republicans, are as good as the ones we had in the days of yore. The committees move, the Senate Armed Services Committee moves the most nominations, I'd say 95% of them through very quickly. Then they get on the Senate executive calendar. The most recent Assistant Secretary of Defense that got confirmed was on the Senate executive calendar and in processing 18 months. No one had any problem with him. No one had any qualms about his qualifications or credentials. It just took that long for them to get to him, and he had to have cloture. He had to break the filibuster and the hold, et cetera. And so nowadays, people put a hold on everybody. So
right, even if they don't have a substantive issue with a person, you just get a hold, and we're upset. We're upset about issue A. Well, as a result, you're not going to get team member that you want in there who has nothing to do with that issue. Let me get to one area that is quite relevant and unique to the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Department of Defense and the military, which really came about during the past year or so, and that's on the military confirmations. There was something unique with Senator Tuberville, Tommy Tuberville, that really I think would be another chapter in the story of the broken process. I'd love for you to kind of explain that to our listeners and viewers. You know, the politics of it all is one thing, what the issue was, but the impact on the confirmation process and on the military perhaps is something that is less understood. Go ahead.
So, Roger, as you well know, we have our 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, and 4 star admirals and generals. And as you get more senior in rank, these are the individuals that are the service chiefs. They're the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They're the 11 warfighting combatant commanders, and we give our parents and give their sons and daughters with the expectation to the military, they're going to be the best trained, the best equipped, and the best led. And so when you get to be a 1 star, you've gone from, second lieutenant to first lieutenant, and you've gone through succession promotion boards that fewer and fewer are picked as you go up in the rank. And from colonel to general officer, the percentage is under 5%. So these are the very best people. And when you go to be a combatant commander as a 4 star, there's only 11 of them. And Senator Tuberville held up for over 8 months, over 900 flag and general officers, not because he had any concern about individuals' qualifications, but DOD had a policy that he disagreed with, which was to allow service members that were in a state that no longer allowed abortions, if they needed a medical procedure, to travel to another state and get reimbursed for that travel. He disagreed with that. I personally myself disagreed with that. But on the other hand, you're not going to change that policy by holding up, and it was unprecedented. It never happened before. And individuals, Senator Tuberville would say things like, well, you know, they've got deputies, they can put the second or third in command. And the point is, we pick the very best people at the top leadership positions. If we'd wanted the number 2 and number 3 to be in charge, we'd have picked them to be in charge.
And you also run the risk, I think, of those people who are qualified. They're waiting around.
That's right.
And they're not going to wait so long.
In talking about it, I said, look, he was a coach at Auburn. They have a great game with Alabama every year. By the way, the University of Georgia has beat Auburn at least the last 3 years. And if his first string quarterback was ready, he would not play his fourth string quarterback against Alabama. That's what he was asking our military to do. And we should not do that. And frankly, we crossed a Rubicon that I wish we had not crossed, which is we ended up doing cloture for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and some of the service commanders because he did not relent, even when his own colleagues on the Senate, Senator Dan Sullivan, Senator Joni Ernst, that had served in combat, saying, look, you really shouldn't be doing this.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned who had served in combat. You're somebody who served in combat, quite modest about it. I see your posts on LinkedIn on Veterans Day and your service during the Vietnam War. It does impact the warfighter.
Absolutely.
And the fact that they can't get the best leaders in place to lead those men and women in uniform undermines the military mission. Go ahead.
Roger, there is a huge difference, and I can speak from personal experience. There's a huge difference between a colonel and a one-star general. Number one, only 50% of the lieutenant colonels make it to colonel, and only less than 5% of colonels make it to general officer. But you've got another 5 years of experience to become a one-star, and you've got to have all kind of commands. To get from 1 star to 4 stars, you're probably talking about another 10 years of experience, and you will have commanded at all kind of levels. So that's the person, that warfighting commander is a 4-star. You want the most senior, most experienced people in charge of our troops in harm's way. And there's a huge difference even between a 1-star and a 4-star. I was a division commander. I was a 2-star. I didn't have the experience to command at the Corps level or the Army level. And so Senator Tuberville really, frankly, did not have a very good understanding of our military, of the role of the military. With due respect, he never served in uniform. Now, here's the other thing. They only could get paid based on when they took on their new rank. And these had all served in uniform, probably 30, 35 years. They don't make a lot of money. And for a 1-star, they were losing $55,000 a year, that they could not get paid. And there was no ability.
As you said, Arnold, it crossed the Rubicon. It put us in a place with respect to military confirmations we wouldn't have expected to have ever gone. Quick question on that is, do you think the impact was so significant, the pushback was so bipartisan that another senator would think twice before doing it again? Or, because you know the Senate quite well, spent a career there, do you think another senator would try to replicate when the next issue emerges what Senator Tuberville did?
Well, Roger, unfortunately, knowing the Senate as well as you and I do and your dad does, one senator, it takes unanimous consent to do anything, and one senator can stop anything the Senate wants to do. And maybe they won't hold up 900 over 8 months like Senator Tuberville did, but I think we're going to see, unfortunately, people hold up some senior military over, it could be a parochial issue in their state. We've seen that many times with civilian leaders in the Pentagon. Unfortunately, and there are going to be a lot of new people in the Senate. 10 Senate seats are going to change. I'm not predicting who's going to be running the Senate, but with the ones that are retiring and the new people, you're going to have, and many of them come from the House. The House really doesn't they don't deal with the confirmation process. They certainly deal with picking the people that ought to be confirmed and putting it in statute. So I really regret the fact. I'll give you a good example. Wendell Ford was the number 2 leader in the Senate when Senator Nunn was chairman. And the floor called me one day and said, "Hey, Arnold, you need to know Senator Ford has put a hold on the 4-star that's going to be chief of staff of the Air Force because he's got a problem with C-130s in the Air Force going to his home state." I immediately got a hold of Senator Nunn, the chairman, He got up from his desk in the Dirksen building, walked right to the Senate floor. I was traipsing behind him. He went and found Wendell Ford and said, Wendell, and they're good friends. And Wendell's chairman of the Rules Committee. He controls our budget. We don't hold up the military. You remove your hold right away. Break. If you want to put a hold on the civilian nominee.
Well, and that's where you go. You go ahead. And that's where I want to go to next, civilian nominees. Again, we're with Arnold Punaro, author of If Confirmed, An Insider's View of the National Security Confirmation Process. And there is no better informed insider than the author who is with us on Reaganism. Arnold, on the civilian side, we've just talked about how the process has been broken on the military side, regrettably. On the civilian side, we've seen some precedents broken as well. I'm going back to President Trump's nomination and the eventual confirmation of General Mattis to become Secretary of Defense. And then President Biden did something similar when he nominated and then Senate confirmed now Secretary Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense. There's a history here. It really goes from General Marshall, who was a Secretary of Defense, and then to Secretary Mattis, where the practice generally was a civilian is what's required to lead the military as Secretary of Defense, and that there needed to be this cooling off period. If you were inclined, if the president was inclined to have a retired former general officer, flag officer, Secretary of Defense of 7+ years. But now it's repeated itself twice in the space of 2 administrations. Talk to us about the importance of this issue. You write about it in the book, I think, quite well and accurately, and whether you think this is the sort of thing that will repeat itself again, or Secretary Mattis and Secretary Austin will continue to be the exception, not the rule, when it comes to Secretaries of Defense.
Well, Roger, I hope it doesn't repeat itself again, and here's why. At the end of our very successful conduct of World War II, and give a lot of credit to our military and certainly the chiefs of the military, we had a War Department and a Navy Department. They were separate. There were issues. So there was a decision was made to combine them into a Department of Defense. And particularly, you had these legendary generals that have been successful, in World War II, including Omar Bradley and Eisenhower and George Marshall and people like that, Chester Nimitz and others. The only time we've had the 5-star rank in our military. And they said, look, but we want the Department of Defense to be totally controlled. We want civilian control of the military. And even back then when it was created, it said recently retired, could not be Secretaries of Defense. And the rule was 10 years. They'd had to be retired for at least 10 years. Because of Korea, President Truman wanted George Marshall to come do it. And Marshall said, look, it's not a good idea, but I'll do it for a year. When he was finished, he said, we should never do this again. So even General Marshall said we should not have retired military.
And that was because of the debacle that was the beginning of the Korean War,
That's
Task
correct.
Force Smith and everything involved.
And so Jim Mattis, Lloyd Austin, fine military leaders and everything. But when you've basically grown up in uniform and people at their level, it's combatant commanders, probably got 40 years of military experience. The military is a very different career pattern than civilians. And you just don't walk away from that overnight just because you've been confirmed to be the Secretary of Defense. So for some reason, a couple of years ago, and you may have been the general counsel of the House Armed Services Committee at the time, they reduced it from 10 years to 7 years.
It was Walter Jones.
Walter Jones, and that wouldn't affect Mattis and Austin. Neither of them were retired for enough time. So they had to get the waiver, and there were hearings on it. A lot of people said, not a good idea, but okay, we'll grant it.
And that's the point. I don't want to run past that point because Walter Jones did reduce it, as you know, from 10 years to 7 years. And I think it was an NDA, that defense policy bill that I had worked on. I can't quite recall exactly what drove him to do it. But in the case of Mattis, as you were just headed, he hadn't even done the 7 years. And it was the president who said, I want this waiver. And it's quite hard for the Congress not to be deferential to when the commander-in-chief says, hey, this is the Secretary of Defense I want, and I'm asking you to waive this requirement, which, of course, the law actually contemplates. The law allows for, provides for this waiver. And it's kind of surprising to me that you have presidents who don't want a civilian, that perhaps they're not appreciating the nuance that you're pointing to, Arnold, which is, hey, you need someone with a non-military, decades-long mindset to run a department which is made up of civilians in addition to military people. I mean, it really starts with the commander-in-chief, doesn't it, Arnold?
That's right. And as you know well from your tremendous expertise in this area, when we rewrote Goldwater Nichols in the operational chain of command in 1986, we were very, very concerned about civilian control of the military. And the chain of command to our warfighters in the field goes from the civilian president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, to the civilian head of the Department of Defense, to the warfighting combatant commanders in the field. It doesn't go through the military chairman of the Joint Chiefs, even though we elevated him in statute, but we elevated the role of the combatant commanders. And so you want those civilians always, and it's a well-honed position. And a lot of people testified against doing that, but you're right. People, and frankly, I think in a lot of laws, there are always going to be emergency circumstances. So you want to give a president an ability to waive. Frankly, I would never have thought the waivers would have been used. And I was frankly not in favor of it, despite my great respect and admiration for both Generals Mattis.
I mean, it wasn't an emergency. That was a preference.
I hope they don't do it again. And I think they should not do it again.
Well, you mentioned.
And by the way, Mike Gallagher in the NDA markup, brought it back to 10 years. So it's back to 10 years now. In terms of
right. So you extended. That was a former Congressman, Mike Gallagher, that extended 10 years. Although still the waiver remains in place.
The waiver's there, but I think as a general rule, very, very difficult for somebody to basically change their stripes and their experience to have a totally different mindset. The reason you have civilian control of the military is because you want civilians to be in charge of life and death decisions, and not the flag and general officers, and not the combatant, commanders, and not the Delta Force or the Navy SEALs. And so you need people that come up that have experience. And we've had some tremendous secretaries of defense, Bill Perry, Harold Brown, Cap Weinberger, Dick Cheney. And so you don't have to have served in the uniform to be a great Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. Interesting. The current Deputy Secretary of Defense, that is Secretary Austin's deputy, Dr. Hicks, Kathleen Hicks, she was one of those people who testified against having a retired general flag officer from becoming Secretary of Defense, or certainly relying on a waiver or doing it less than the 7 years. I want to go on to a couple of things and get to the reforms of the confirmation process that you recommend in your book, but also, before we get there, I want to talk about how the current climate, the social media climate in particular, has impacted the confirmation process. It's a fantastic manual, in addition to being a work of history in terms of how do you get through the confirmation process. And at certain points in the book, you have the steps involved. I mean, it's really anybody who's blessed with the opportunity to serve and requires Senate confirmation, they have to really read your book, because it reads at times like the manual. But also you have these stories. One is with the one of the undersecretaries of defense, one for policy, a very important role in the Department of Defense, Dr. Colin Colin Call, who had a very lengthy social media profile during the Trump years, and it made his confirmation very complicated. Tell us about that story. And it was a sort of thing you probably would not have had to encounter before the days of social media.
Yeah, and so the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is one of the key civilian leaders in the Pentagon, the person that works with the National Security Council, works with Congress. And as a fundamental rule, I believe that we've got to continue to have bipartisan support for national security. And we should not have people in the Pentagon that can't get a bipartisan support for their confirmation. When it became clear that Colin Call was not going to have any bipartisan support, they should have pulled his nomination, and the Senate Armed Services Committee should not have sent his name to the Senate floor. And the reason he didn't have bipartisan support was, if you go back and look at his social media tweets, he said some very extreme things about certain people, and inappropriate for somebody, in my judgment, that wanted to be the bipartisan, objective policy recommender, to the Secretary of Defense and to the National Security Council. And so we've seen that a lot now. People in both parties There were in the Trump administration, he nominated some people. Mark Green, the great chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House now, had some social media comments. They nominated him to be the Secretary of the Army, and they basically had to pull his name back because he wasn't going to get through even a Republican-led Senate at the time. Colin Kahl, I think that and Jim Inhofe, by the way, when he was chairman, and Trump nominated Anthony Tata to be the Undersecretary for Defense Policy, and he had some inappropriate tweets in social media. Jim Inhofe said, we're not purchasing him. I think Chairman Jack Reed should have taken the same stance with Colin Kahl. I don't think, and by the way, Colin Kahl is the only person that I can find in the whole history of the Department of Defense that did not get a bipartisan vote to become confirmed to serve in the Department of Defense. Right now, Undersecretary for Policy, there are 9 Senate confirmed positions there. 6 of them are vacant. And we have acting people in a lot of key jobs.
It goes back to the point you made earlier. I mean, Colin Kahl, know him well. He left, returned, I think, to the academia out in Stanford University, and they've been unable to replace him with a confirmed person serving in the job.
That's right. They nominated Derek Chollet, and while he did a good job in the Obama administration, he was at stake when some of the bad decisions were made about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and people were asking him some really, really tough questions. And it was clear that in the Senate Armed Services Committee, he did not have the votes to be reported. And so they made him the chief of staff. And by the way, in the Trump administration, when Tony Tata couldn't get through as Undersecretary for Policy, they put him in as the deputy under the Federal Vacancy Act, and then made him acting as Undersecretary. So
well, let's go there for a second. That's where I want to go before we get to the reforms, and then we'll go to our lightning round. Arnold, what you're seeing because of the dysfunction, or what you call the broken process, is that administrations rightly want to get their people involved. Sure. The President of the United States, who's elected by the American people, should rightfully have the people who he respects, the people who he has confidence in, serve and execute his or her administration's policies. And while the Senate has the power to confirm, it's not working, and it's not, quite frankly, fair to the president when the Senate doesn't put people through. And as a result, now they're putting people in acting capacities and exploring a variety of workarounds that are far more prevalent today in 2024 than they were even 5 years ago, let alone a decade plus ago. Do you expect in the next administration, whether it's round 2 for President Biden or round 2 for President Trump, that we're going to see many more in this acting role that is not getting confirmed by the Senate, and the president relying a lot of people in some sort of chief of staff, non-confirmation role to carry out the major responsibilities of these agencies, including the Department of Defense?
Roger, I'm very sad to say, yes, I expect that, and it's absolutely going to happen. It doesn't matter whether it's going to be, the second term for whichever one. I think you're going to see a significant number on day one, January 20th, of what we call Schedule Cs, which are political appointees that don't go through the confirmation process, non-career senior executive service people that don't go through the confirmation process, put in place to get control of that agency, whether it's DOD or the State Department, on day one. And that's going to happen because they look and see that. And frankly, again, the Senate ought to be deferential to the president. That's the way the founding fathers set it up, unless there's some compelling reason not to confirm somebody. And I don't mind people putting a hold on somebody if they have a question about their qualifications or capabilities, but that's not what's happening. And people are put in. It doesn't matter, frankly, being candid, it doesn't matter who runs the Senate. Whichever party's in the minority, they're going to hold up the other party's nominees. It's happened. It started, way back when Harry Reid was the leader. And so we've gotten ourselves in this just total knotty situation. And that's why we've got to have these reforms. So you're going to see a lot more actings. And frankly, if you're the United States Senate, you shouldn't want that, because what they're doing when they do that is they're totally dissing your role in the
advice. There's no accountability.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move now to the reform. So, one course is going to be what we just discussed. people in an acting capacity. There'll be Schedule Cs, there'll be political appointments and other ways, and they'll be carrying out the duties of these very important functions without accountability to the U.S. Senate. And, there are rules and limitations on how long such folks can stay in the job. But a president of the United States and his team in the White House can figure out how to manage it because they've been doing that for years, frankly, because confirmations have not gone through. If we're going to continue and have a functional confirmation process, the ones that our founders intended, we have, what are some of the reforms that are required, Arnold?
Well, I would say first thing I would do is significantly reduce the number of people in the Department of Defense and other agencies that require Senate confirmation. And you can do that because when the Assistant Secretaries of Defense were formed, you didn't have Undersecretaries of Defense. So you now have 6 undersecretaries in which all the OSD assistant secretaries work for. So you've got a layer of civilian political control higher up where you could basically reduce those. And then in the military departments, the assistant secretaries in the military departments work for the undersecretary and the service secretary. So you could take them out of the confirmation process. That would be a huge reduction in the number. And then you could focus more on oversight on the key jobs that remain. Number 2, when it comes to the military, there's no reason for the Senate to confirm people from captain to major, major to lieutenant colonel to colonel, 50,000 a year. They should just focus on the roughly 1,000 flag and general officers in our military, and particularly spend more time on the senior 3 and 4 stars. And so significantly reduce the number would be the first thing that I would do. The second thing I would do is the paperwork monster associated with confirmation is a real disincentive. The executive branch has totally different paperwork than the Senate. It's all done by stubby pencil. It's not done electronically. They ought to go to using the same forms. It ought to be all electronic, and they ought to allow things to be signed electronically like we do in the business world. And then the third thing on reform would be basically time certain for something to be kicked out of committee and time certain on the floor. So let's say you get somebody that's referred to the Senate Armed Services Committee. If they are not voted out of committee by a time certain, if there's no, problem with the individual, it gets sent automatically to the Senate executive calendar. If somebody puts a hold on that nominee, as happens now for every single one that gets kicked out by the SASC, the parliamentarian would rule whether that hold is germane, meaning does it relate to the individual's qualifications and capabilities, or does it relate to a policy?
So let's drill down on that one. That's super interesting because that would really open the aperture here and solve these holds. So we were just talking about Derek Chollet, and served as an assistant secretary of defense during the Obama administration, was a counselor to the Secretary of State in the Biden administration, nominated to be the Undersecretary for Policy in the Department of Defense, but he was in the State Department and was involved during the Biden administration botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, tragic withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's holding him up. How would that one play out?
Well, assuming he had a majority vote in the Senate Armed Services Committee, Roger, and I'll be candid, I don't know whether that was the case or not. And I think if he did, Chairman Reed would have sent him to the Senate executive calendar. So it may be there was some concern on somebody on the Democratic side. But let's say hypothetically, it gets kicked out to the Senate executive calendar and the hold is placed on him, and the parliamentarian would rule whether or not the hold was germane to his qualifications or whether it was related to something else. If they said it was not germane, then it would go on a clock, a time certain for the Senate to basically call it up on the executive calendar and vote yes or no. So that would be how it would work.
And that would have to be something that the Senate rule for the next Congress would have to
have to change
adopt.
the Senate rules. And look, if we're going to fix a broken process, both the executive branch and the legislative branch is going to have to give up some of their prerogatives and give up some of their power. That's the bottom line. If you don't do that, and frankly, I mean, the Senate and House, unfortunately, have been adding new Senate confirmed positions at the cyclical rate. They've added 4 ASDs. Now you had one of these FACA boards recommend creating a new undersecretary. And so we're going in the wrong direction.
So the irony is that they keep on adding roles in the Department of Defense in particular that require Senate confirmation, while the Senate isn't able to confirm pretty much anybody outside of the the senior-most positions.
I think you're going to see a lot, as you hinted and you said, you're going to see workarounds that nobody is going to like because they're not going to put up with this. And the individuals that want to serve their government and make big sacrifices, they don't deserve to be put on into what I call
their life is on hold as they're waiting for the Senate to move on
They
it.
don't know if they're going to heaven or hell. They don't know when they're going to get voted on. Again, 18 months in the process. And some of them basically go into purgatory and they never get approved. And
yeah, no way to be, and no way to incentivize and encourage or help people engage in public service. Arnold, let's move to our lightning round. Thank you for this fascinating conversation. Congrats on your third book. If confirmed, go online on Amazon, wherever you get your books, and purchase it. Really, truly an insider's view of the confirmation process. Arnold, here's where we ask our guests to give us their favorite Reagan quote, favorite Reagan speech, and favorite Reagan book. You can give us all three, two, or just one. Share something.
Well, I would say my favorite quote, and it's not hard for me as a United States Marine. Reagan said, some people spend an entire lifetime wondering if they make the difference, and the United States Marines don't have that problem. So that's my favorite quote. And frankly, you and I, military people in background, you'd be hard pressed, and we were reminded of that. And I frankly give the current commander in chief credit for quoting Ronald Reagan speech at the 40th anniversary of D-Day. The Army Rangers, the boys of Pointe du Hoc, what they did at that, and Reagan's speech was so inspirational. The courage and bravery of those Army Rangers fused together to defy rational explanation. You cannot explain their bravery. And I would say on the book, there's a book that you know well, The Wit and Wisdom of Ronald Reagan by James Home. And I used to carpool with my buddy Roland McElroy to the Senate in the days when Reagan had his little radio show, and we would hear him for a couple of minutes every morning, and he just made such great sense. And one of the things I remember him talking about when it comes to defense, which you and I care about deeply, he said, and this is Reagan talking about himself, he said, of the 4 wars in my lifetime, none came about because the U.S. was too strong. We need to fix this confirmation process so we get the strongest people possible running our Department of Defense and commanding our troops in harm's way.
Arnold Punaro, thank you so much for being on the show. That's a great lightning round response.
Such a great privilege to be with you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.